You go be what you are, Cal. I'll be what I am. What did a man do if he didn't know what he was, or even what he wanted to be?
Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for the Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth.
Welcome to episode 16 of The Storming Journey. I'm Adam, and I'll be the Ardent today, and we will be looking at chapter 16 of The Way of Kings.
I'm Elle, and I'll be today's Worldsinger.
And I'm Liz, I'll be your Veristitalian.
Okay, so for today's world singing, I was thinking about Laurel as I was reading this chapter, and I identified with Laurel in a way that I don't think I've ever really identified with her before, because I was suddenly reminded of basically my entire high school and college life when I was trying to get boys to be interested in me. And not wanting to fully commit to being open about the fact that I was interested in them, because if I could give a level of plausible deniability, then it was safer and easier and I wouldn't get heartbroken if it turned out they didn't like me. Because the whole time Laurel is like, yeah, you should go do this thing, because if you do, then you could be a light-eyed, and, light-eyes marry light-eyes, and that could be a thing. And the other thing I was thinking about, I know that's just a general thought, but the other thing I was thinking about was there was a guy I was dating in college who I guess I convinced him to switch to linguistics, his major. And I don't really know how that happened or why that happened, but he switched from his original program. And then we broke up because he broke up with me 3 months later. And I had to be his TA for two of our linguistics classes, two completely different linguistics classes. If there's any moral to take from this, maybe don't try to convince your significant other to switch into your degree program, because you might have to teach them and that will be awkward. Yeah. So that's my world singing for today.
I think the other moral is boys are gross. Don't date them.
Indeed. Okay, so I have the Storm's Eye view for today, which is probably over 100 words, but that's okay. Young Cal talks with Laurel about their hopes for the future. His father wants him to become a surgeon, but Laurel hopes that he will win a shard blade and become a light eyes. Why? For reasons. Tien presents Cal with some pretty stones, and Cal entertains him by catching crab frogs. Some older boys from the town pick an argument with Cal because of his family's position, and Cal engages one of them in a fight and finds that the staff feels right in his hand. He begs them to teach him about fighting, but they refuse. When Cal returns home, his father announces that Lord Wistio has died and left Lyrian with spheres to pay for Cal's education.
I think For Reasons is the new Raffo, or at least it's Liz's way of a Raffo. So if Liz ever gets asked a question on a stage and it's a Raffo question, she'll go, for reasons.
Many reasons.
So today's theme is influence, and I chose this theme because I think Kaladin's plot, especially in this chapter, is asking who is influencing him and how is he being influenced into certain pathways for his life. He is beginning puberty, which is very aware in this chapter, right? Where it's oh, well, hey, girls exist. What are these things? Why am I why are things happening in my body around these long-haired women things? And then he's also but also, why am I really despondent? Why am I becoming a man? Ultimately, Brandon Sanderson as the gender questioner is something I never thought I would say, but here we are in chapter 16. But I chose this theme of influence because I want to think through with both of you, Liz and Elle, about the influence on Cal, the influence that Cal is asserting on others, the different things that are happening. Because I think this chapter really encapsulates all of the different pathways that Cal could go. And a lot of the backstory for Cal is that struggle of he's being influenced in at least two directions, right? Surgeon or soldier. But I think this chapter reveals that he's could be influenced into other ways and that he's really reflective to those influences. He's not quite an agent in of himself. He's really being shaped and pushed in multiple ways. But I want opening thoughts here about that. When you were reading it through, what did you see when it came to thinking about influence?
I thought a lot about how when you are that sort of young, early teenager age, it's so easy to be influenced by just little things that happen and you don't know why they become so significant in your life, but like they don't have to be anything big. And just like having a conversation with Laurel, or I mean looking at rocks with Tien. And these things become big symbols in Cal's life and problems that he has down the road. It reminded me of one of the essays my students read in our creative nonfiction class is George Orwell's Such Were the Joys, which is a very traumatic essay about his years growing up in British boarding school, which was very bad. But just how all of these little things that he remembers the details of that were so significant to him as a child, and he can barely remember like why they were significant. And looking back as an adult, they seem really dumb. But those little things are significant to you when you're at this point of deciding where to go in your life.
Yeah, like I got into linguistics because of a book my parents owned. Like we had a library, and so you could read any of the books that you wanted that my parents had, and they had a book on linguistics, and I picked it up for some reason. I genuinely can't remember why, and I thought it was super interesting. And then I was like, well, I'm going to study linguistics now. And even when I had other pathways, like I considered going into genetics and being a genetic counselor, like I had other things, but I kept coming back to linguistics. And it's weird that this one book that is bad that I've referenced before made such an impact on me because it's just a book. Like, to some extent, it's like it is just a book that I could have read. I could have read any other number of books. But I think Kaladin is... I think he is struggling with like the drive to respond to any of the influences he has because he doesn't... The time that he finally feels this influence or like some drive is when something clicks with the spear in his hands. And then that becomes something he wants to pursue. But before that, everything else doesn't feel like a passion or an interest. It just feels like he's on an inner tube on a river, like just floating down and like getting pushed by other people, by rocks or whatever, and just...
I think that pulls out one of the really important things to think about influence, especially as it's like illustrated in this chapter, influence of being asserted on you and influence that you are asserting onto other people. Or like how you are affecting the world around you versus how the world around you is affecting you. Because Kaladin shifts back and forth between soldier and surgeon throughout the chapter and throughout his story in the flashbacks, right? And I mean, going forward as well. But his the key moment that you're pulling out, Elle, is when he like grabs a quarterstaff, right? And he finally feels something and then he wants to learn. But before that, he's even considering becoming a soldier, right? Because of the influence of Laurel. The name like escaped me for 2 seconds. But because of her saying like, oh, you could go become a Light Eyes. And then before that, right, he has the influence of his father saying you become a surgeon. And I think there's also some other influences in the chapter for his pathway. There's a moment when he's like, I really want to go travel the world and I want to go see the world and I want to go do that. And he's also could be influenced to be like a good brother and son. It's a moment where like the world's kind of really open to him. And so that's why he can be so influenced in a certain way. And I think later on, when that influence is taken away and like a moment is, or a pathway is closed to him, you kind of have to become a little bit more hardened to the world in some way, because you're like, now I have to go on this pathway. I can no longer be influenced that way. But later on, it changes, right? And so like I see a lot of his story when thinking about it through how he's influenced and how he is influencing the world as something that is like world shaping in some way, but also reactive, right? So there's a tension, I think, in that, in his story.
It's also interesting because this is fiction and it is told in a flashback. Like, we know where some of these things will lead. Like, Kaladin will be good at the spear because he's meant to be good at the spear, and like spiritual mumbo jumbo. But in your real life, when it's easy to believe like the survivorship bias, right? And to look back on people's stories and pick out, oh, well, these are the obvious moments that led to this person becoming this thing. When Elle read that book in middle school, that led to her becoming a linguistics person. But if she had become a geneticist, she'd have a different part of her childhood that was like, oh, that was the moment that led to me becoming this. And so it can be easy to fall into kind of this this need to make yourself the main character, right? And like have this destiny and this storyline, when most people's lives are not like that. Most people's lives do have twists and turns and don't have a, when I was 2, I picked up, you know, a spatula. And so I knew I was destined to become a great cake baker. Like, that's not how life really works. And so it kind of bothered me a little bit in this chapter, actually, because most of us go through life like Cal in the rest of the chapter of like, you know, our friends want us to do this and we want to fit in with the guys in town. And so we don't want to use our 2-syllable name or 3-syllable name. We want to have a normal dark guy's name and we want to be soldiers like them so that we'll fit in and like the guys will like us. And we don't want to disappoint our parents. And like, those are the things that really go into shaping who we are, rather than like this one moment of like clarity that this is my destiny, which happens a lot in books.
I think I pulled that out. In my notes, one of the things that I wrote was that Tien's influence seems to be the most impactful throughout the rest of Kaladin's life. Like, he does like have memories of things his father says and his father's training, as we've seen even now, or like in the present time of Way of Kings and going forward. But I think Tien really makes the most difference. And like, Tien is able to change Kaladin's mood in a way that nobody else can. And I think that's really interesting to think about, the fact that the most impactful influence was not a career choice, but the way that he was treated and the way that he was loved.
I want to fold onto 2 different thoughts from both those comments. So I first want to go a little bit into Liz's idea about narrative and main character, and then go into Elle's idea about occupation, because I do think that's kind of where I wanted our conversation to ultimately culminate, is why is Cal so bound to like those 2 occupations, right? Soldier or surgeon, and how does that relate to our lives, right? Of how we're always bound to our occupations. So that's going to be after we talk about Liz's idea, though, about this main characterness and this influencing, because it made me think about just like a Mormon moment, basically, if we can take one, where a lot of the prophets in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, when their narratives are told of how they became a prophet, it's related back to an influential childhood story, right? Which is a way of making them be a little bit more main character-y, right? Which they already are main characters since they're considered prophets and everything. But we have to, I think, always consider that when we're like weighing like how are we being influenced to make this person into something that we can like, I'm going to say idolize, but idolize not in the like celebrity way. There's some celebrity to it, but like idolize in a way of like, this is the type of person that I want to be in some sense, right? So like with Joseph Smith, right? He has his influential moment with James, was it 1:5? Is that the verse? And like, that's his, hero origin story or whatever, right? I guess we could call it something like that. But like, if you read like through all of the different biographies that come out about Mormon prophets, there's always like something in their childhood that connects, right? You had Thomas S. Monson with, I think, the fire story of being a kid and like almost starting a fire or something, and how that ultimately like shaped the rest of his life, or how he cared for adults when he was like younger, and the older people in the area. Or I don't remember what the other ones are, but like a lot of them have those like connective stories of that like thing to help connect influence. Also, I mean, they're good people, and we all have those like singular stories that make us the main character. So I want to think a little bit more about that, if you guys are open to that.
I think some of that is definitely a factor of the not just like the like narrativization of people's lives, but also the way that like that's going to be inevitable in terms of like we have George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Like Abraham Lincoln's very classic, like I didn't tell the lie about whatever in my childhood kind of thing. But my passion project right now is Sunday school, LDS Sunday school manuals. And so I research how those change. And one of the things that I have noticed is using narratives to try to teach lessons. And one of the important things is that the lesson that you take from a narrative will change depending on what you want to take from the narrative. And I mean, that's some of what we're doing here in like the way that we use a specific theme brings out different things in the chapter than we would normally see. And so in these manuals, because of the way that the Sunday school organization works, the themes that are pulled out are very specific and very intentional. And when you have human people, especially, like they are historical figures, we knew them, we have their artifacts and their writings with like very modern Doctrine and Covenant stuff, the narrativization ends up creating this trajectory of, well, we have to make it clear and concise and fit in what the story we are trying to tell is. And I'm trying to remember what my point to all of this was. I think my point was, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say,
You probably
just
know
that,
now.
well, that's what we do with our lives when we tell our stories to people, right? And that's what's going on in fiction as well, right? We tell the story of a person to lead somewhere, which, like, you know, postmodernism tried to get away from that, but humans really like stories that lead somewhere, and where everything is significant. And so I think there's a reason we always come back to it. Anyway.
But yeah, I just think that like, I think narrativization is inevitable. But the problem that I see with the manuals is that we make ourselves unwilling to see other interpretations of the narratives. We've locked ourselves. A really good example of this is the story of King David. Ends up being framed as a story of how do you avoid temptation, instead of maybe talking about power dynamics. And like, it's not really just about temptation and not being tempting to other people. But we have stuck ourselves in this is how we are going to interpret the story of King David. And so I think narrativization is fine as long as we're not locking ourselves into that was inevitable or that is the only way to interpret it.
Cue Thanos, I am inevitable. I think that really pulls on Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's idea of like the problem of a single story. There's like the famous TED talk that she gave of like telling a single story for all mankind or telling a single story for a lot of things, which is also like a thing that pulls out when you're like in today's academic conversations around like like anti-colonialism and post-colonialism stuff, right? Where it's like we've told a single story so much through history that all the marginalized individuals have lost their story, or their story isn't a part of that norm story that we're telling. And so it's like lifting up those voices and things like that. And also thinking of, I like that we're having this meta moment around our theme choice, right? Because it's, if you read this through a different theme, right? If I hadn't chosen influence, we would have come out with a different idea, right? Each week we could have an entirely different thing, which is what I think sacred reading podcast in general invites people to do, right? It invites other people to take their own themes and read a text. That's what, scripture reading and why returning to scriptures and why going to that single text over and over again is so important in our religion, right? Is not because you're going to get the same thing from what you read. You're not always going to have the same lesson come out because you're returning to it with new eyes because of experience and you're approaching it through a different direction, right? Your influence is a little bit different. The influence you're placing on the text and the influence the text is placing back on you in that like relationship that the reader and the text have together. My problem with recording these so late at night is this is when I drink all my water is also late at night. But Liz will edit all the pauses in post. So bless Liz and her beautiful hands. So I want to turn to the latter part of our discussion, which I wanted to be around like the connection of Kaladin to his two plot lines of occupation, right? And thinking about that and how like the influence in our life is usually, we always talk about our careers or we talk about the thing we're doing, right? And I want to also hopefully bring in this another side of influence that I was thinking about when reading through the chapter, which is the influence or is always like the approach that I try to take. It comes from like the feminist theory that I read, but also my own feminist ethic of always asking about the system in place. And I think Roshar is a very easy one to go into systems and hierarchies and things like that. So I'm curious what y'all thought about the influence of the system itself, especially in the conversation around is it non, right? They're like levels of society.
Non and Don.
I was thinking,
Yes.
I was thinking about the bread, like non-bread. Roman point, not the other thing. But I saw that was it, especially when Cal brought up his non to the other characters at the very end of the chapter when they're all having their little childhood fight and whacking each other with sticks, which brought back bad memories for me from my childhood when my brother would beat me with a stick in the backyard. We were playing; it wasn't like negative, but there's an influence of the system itself within the chapter, right? Where Cal asserts his influence from his higher non, also his greater like knowledge from that system, but also the system itself is asserted on him because Cal won't just become a farmer. Like I don't think farmer's ever an occupational like desire. Like it's not only is it not an occupational desire for him, it's not an occupation he would ever have. Because as someone from second non, right, he has that ability to travel. He has that ability to go places. So I'm curious what y'all thought about that idea of influence when it relates to the occupation and also the systemic influence that's occurring in the chapter.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the case that it's much more pre-industrial in the way that it thinks about, like, you will have your family's occupation. You'll stay in the same social class. The other kids in the town are sons of farmers, so they will be farmers or they will be soldiers, and like that's it. Those are your options. And Cal has this opportunity to follow after his father's profession, but Laurel's trying to encourage him to become a light eye so he can jump in the social structure, right? Because otherwise there's this limitation between them. So it is interesting that this is a chapter where we do get a lot of the social structures, even again with Cal's name, and he goes by Cal in the flashback chapters because he is really uncomfortable with his name sounding too high for his class, which is really interesting and kind of peters off later in the books, but it's definitely in Way of Kings a lot. This anxiety that like his father's trying to put them higher than their station, and Cal's uncomfortable with that.
I'm thinking, because I brought up the linguistics thing, when I was thinking about what I was going to do in linguistics, like what kind of career I was going to have, I was significantly influenced by the structure I was in of what I had been taught regarding the role of women in the LDS church and the role of women being to be a mother and to be a stay-at-home mom, and that being the goal, and not necessarily to not think about a career, but to think about a career in the context of, can you do it with your family? Can you set it aside until your kids are out of the house? And it wasn't that I didn't have a model of like a woman working, because my mom worked I think at least when I was in high school. So I wasn't fully out of the house, but she was working. But I always went into it with this assumption that I need to have a career that works with having a family. And so when I went into linguistics, I was like, okay, maybe I can be a professor because that's something I could do while having a family. And then I ended up reading this article about basically how it's really hard for women to be like tenured professors because of like raising a family at the same time as like trying to get tenure track. It can be extremely hard. And I was like, oh, so that's not a feasible goal. So I stopped pursuing a career in academia because I was like, I don't want to not be able to have a family because of this. And like my life has been significantly different. Things just panned out differently than I thought. But because of the structure I was in, the assumptions I was making about what my life should be looking like, it very much directed my choices. And I do see Kaladin doing the same thing of, well, the choice I'm being asked to make because of my social standing is surgeon, because that would allow me to basically keep my social standing in a better way than like being a soldier would. And it feels to me that Kaladin is going with the default surgeon option because he's like, well, that's like the best thing for my station. Like my dad wants me to do it, but also like that feels like the right thing to do. I feel pressured into doing that. Being a soldier would be a rebellion of his social standing.
I think something else that you highlight on like connecting, I think it's really generative to connect a lot of the hierarchy and Way of Kings and Roshar to like Mormon hierarchy in many ways. Because I think that I don't want to say it was something Brandon was thinking about, right? But I think like it's an influence in and of itself within the text. But what your experience made me think of is just like the gender dynamic of it and how Cal being a man within the system is also influential on it, right? He doesn't have to worry about getting pregnant, for example, in this moment, right? In his future life, he just has to worry about kind of caring for himself and maybe finding a girl, right? And your story about trying to decide your major based on also your family reminds me of my first year at BYU when I was trying to pick a major, and I went through like 5 or 6 different ones trying to think through how can I pick a good major to get a job, because I'm going to have to be the breadwinner for the family, right? Because the wife will be having babies. Obviously, the whole wife thing will not ever work out over here. But so that was like pre-figuring that part out. But like I had this like, during my first year, it was always like, well, what if I did this? And it was like creating so many different pathways and trying to figure out what was the best way to find a job that would make me happy, but also bring in money quickly, so that just in case I'm like, I've been like 21 getting back from a mission. So if I was getting married at 23, so I could take care of that family, right? Because then it would be like, oh, you're a dad by 24, which is terrifying. And I know people do it, but I'm terrified for them. Terrified for anyone who has children. We all should be terrified because we're all humans, but y'all can speak better to that because you both have children. I just have a dog. But I think there's this like gender dynamic to it, right? Especially of influence toward for Kaladin, and influence toward the different directions, right? Because it's his father saying you're going to be a good surgeon, and his father ultimately doesn't really want him to come back to the home, right? In a later flashback, we learn that Liren is like, go to Carbranth and don't come back here with the money, right? Even though at the end of this chapter, he's like, this is the money for you to go to Carbranth so that we're good. You come back here and be all good. I think Liren's influence on him kind of expands. Excuse me. But I'm thinking just a lot in that gender dynamic of Laurel's influence on Kaladin, saying you become a soldier, you have the 0.000000001% chance of becoming a Light Eyes. It's such a naive and childlike influence in some ways, but I think it's interesting because that is not the thing that he connects with ultimately to become a soldier, right? It's his desire to sacrifice for someone else to protect other people, right? At the same time, it says, I really like this staff thing. I don't know why I like holding a long staff in my hand, but I do. And I think that's an interesting part where he doesn't follow through on Laurel's influence. He follows through on Tien's influence, right, later on. And I think that's just an interesting highlight from this chapter.
That's really interesting because that is like, it's not Laurel's influence that convinces him to become a soldier. It's not even like the fighting with a staff or a spear feels right to him, like he's willing to give that up. But he's influenced by his relationship with Tien and his desire to protect, which is why, the whole Knights Radiant thing happens. That is his strongest value. So he's influenced by a relationship, and that one with Tien is the strongest one out of all of them, even more than his relationship with his father, right? More than his relationship with Laurel, more than his desire for approval of his peers. That's the one that really impacts him the most.
And it's also the one that comes back through this flashback. He has the rock at the beginning, which helps him overcome his melancholy. But then the rock comes back, right? It's the influence that he keeps returning to is Tien's relationship. Like, using this term influence, like, brings a different valence to it, right? But it really is like the relationship that holds through not only this flashback, but also pulls forward into the next chapter, right? When he calls out Tien, when he's like driving the bridge, and like holds through his storyline of this relationship to that younger brother. I was noticing how it was the rocks at the beginning, and then at the end of the chapter, he sees the rocks again, and this like return to that relationship and that influence on him beyond all the other ones, right? Like, we know eventually he's going to be influenced to be a soldier. We know that influence comes from external factors, but it's always Tien that's the thing that is kind of guiding him. It's his guiding rock.
No pun intended, right? His guiding rock.
I, at one point, had this idea of writing a fan fiction of what if Kaladin went to Kharbrandt and still became a Windrunner, but in the context of finding out that the hospital was a death trap sort of situation. And I wrote like the first little bit of it, and I thought it was really interesting to explore that, but I kept running into this problem of like, how, like, can I keep Tien alive? Like, can Tien live? And I kept coming back to, no, Tien actually does have to die. For Kaladin's story to progress, like, Tien has to die. Which is tragic. Like, I don't love that in a character. It reminds me a little bit of, like, Prim in The Hunger Games. Like, Prim and Tien both, like, have tragedy, and that is what propels the main character. And, like, the first time you see Katniss is Prim is getting called to be one of the people in the Hunger Games, and that's the thing, that the inciting incident. And so I think the fact that Tien's influence is so strong really speaks to, like, even in a fan fiction I was writing, Tien's influence could not be understated. And, like, Tien still had to die, even with a completely different path, because that was what Kaladin remembered. And it, like, his narrative is incomplete without Tien and Tien's innocence being preserved. I think it's a lot harder if Tien had grown up and become an adult and started having a personality in a very, or like pushing back a little bit more and not being Kaladin's idealized brother. We obviously like see moments where Tien's not perfect, but it's easier to idealize someone who's no longer around. And I think that's part of why, like, Tien's death had to happen so that Kaladin could continue to idealize him.
Are you theorizing the opposite of plot armor? It's a plot death. Plot murder. On that note, I think we're ready to move into our sacred reading for this episode, which is going to be Likening. So we're going to ask, who in your life needs to die for you to I'm kidding. We're not doing that. That would be uncomfortable. Unless y'all want to do that.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
Who are you willing to lose to change your life? We are going to do likening, though, for this. But hopefully you don't liken it to murder, because that would be uncomfortable. Probably for you and your spouse or children, if they're listening to this. I just have my dog in my life, and if she dies, I'm going postal, so... We've recently come to terms with her mortality, because she has cancer still probably, so we have to deal with that. But I always tell her it's, if I die, she can eat me, and if she dies, I'll cry. That's our trade-off. But to the sacred reading, which we'll keep sacred, perhaps. This reminds me of a brief aside, another Mormon moment. But I was at a state conference that Dallin Oaks came through to, and he's now the president of the True Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints. This is before he was that, so he was an apostle. And he came through, and it was the Saturday evening session, and he got up and he's like, "It's Saturday. It's not Sunday. We can have some fun." And like, he's like, we don't have to be all sacred and somber. It's Saturday. Let's have fun. So this is our having fun with sacrality and murder. See, I'm trying to say murder a lot because it's a way that the algorithm can like pull in. This is like a murder podcast now.
They'll filter us out.
I think that should probably be the title. Murder question mark? Who would you murder?
Perfect.
No, that should not be the title. Okay, likening, sacred reading. So likening, to remind our readers and to remind us about the sacred practice, it is bringing out from the text you're reading and connecting it to something in your real life. So it's pulling a moment from the text or pulling ideas from the text and likening or making like them to yourself in your life. And we've been doing this a little bit throughout our conversation around influence, but I want us to all take a moment to kind of pick a moment or pick a influential connection and influential relationship that we saw in this chapter and kind of liken it to something in our own life to think a little bit deeper about that. So I think we can all like maybe take like a moment or something to think through that and kind of find something, and whoever finds something first can kind of speak up. Does that sound good? Right. And for you, dear listener, we'll shorten the finding a moment in post. All right. Have we found spots? Who wants to go first?
I can go first. I've done a lot of likening in this one, so I was trying to find a character interaction that I hadn't likened myself to already, which was harder than I expected. But I was thinking about when Cal is talking to Jost, where Cal says, "Teach me, I'll worm for you. My father gives me 2 hours off. I'll do your work then if you'll teach me." And he is basically saying, like, I will go out of my way to learn this thing that feels really important to me and interesting. And it's like finally the spark of something that like is like taking him out of his melancholy a little bit. That feels like the experience that I had when I was kind of pursuing the Sunday school research. As I've mentioned, I've been dealing with depression for almost 10 years now, and it has been really hard because mostly the fatigue aspect. It's just I don't have the capacity that I used to have, and that's really frustrating. And I was a stay-at-home mom for the first few years of my kid's life, and but I had this moment of this is a thing I'm really interested in pursuing, and I was willing to go for it. I was willing to, even though my medications weren't properly working, they're still not really properly working. I signed up or I applied to grad school and got into grad school of my own accord. I took on this project that I originally thought would take 3 weeks, and it's 3 years later. Such as academics. But there was a spark of something that finally I was interested in that like got through the fatigue and the depression, and I was willing to do what it took to keep pursuing that so that I could still have that like little spark of something in my life. So that's what I would like to liken.
You can go first, Adam, if you want.
I'll go. And then we'll switch it up for when we do the final segment. I wanted to liken to Tian's influence on Cal, thinking specifically through this last, I was about to call it last verse, but one of the last paragraphs of the chapter. It's the third to last paragraph where he's picking up the rock that Tien has left him. And it says, it looked like a face smiling at him made of white bits in the rock. Cal smiled despite himself, though it quickly faded. A rock wasn't going to solve his problems. So the rock is a symbol that's coming throughout the chapter that's returning him to Tien and also reminding him of like the broader connection there and influencing him into a more positive light. And it made me, I liken it a lot to myself because like that's what I try to do with other people is what Tien's doing with Kaladin. I usually try to like leave them something nice because usually I'm not able to like be there for a long time with a lot of people because I have a lot that I'm juggling within my schedule. But like the small little things that I can leave that maybe like help someone have a happier day. Like I usually leave people post-it notes or things like that in my department, or I try to like leave people a nice little note just to like, it's like we can't spend like 3 hours spending time together, right? But know that like I'm still thinking about you in like good ways. And I think that is a lot of the connection of Tien to Kaladin there, right? Is the leaving the rocks is like leaving a note in many ways. There are other like neurodivergent readings to it, but here I'm kind of connecting it to this idea of like always reminding the people around us about our connections is really important and really a good way to have an influence on someone's day, but not influence them in going in a certain direction. Just have an influence on like their emotions, right? Which is something we didn't quite talk about during this episode, but I think is a really important part of influence, right? Is you're not just influencing someone in their life and the direction it's taking, you're also influencing them in whether they can have a good day or a bad day. And Tien here is always influencing toward a good day in many ways.
And the one I was looking at is kind of from the beginning of the chapter where Laurel is asking what Cal's going to do if his father tries to send him to Carbranth, and Cal says the surgeons won't take anyone before their 16th weeping, so I've got time to think. One of my like current life questions is, do I go on and get a PhD and try to pursue like being a full-time professor? Is that like where I want to go? And I'm in a position right now where I'm just taking time to think about it. And I think that's really valuable. And Cal has that kind of snatched away from him at the end of the chapter that, oh, no, Lord Wistio said this is what he wants for you, and you're not going to deny him his dying wish. But like having that time to not pressure myself into one decision or the other, but just taking some time to think about it is where I saw myself in this chapter.
And I think that's also like such a good thing to build out influence on your own life, right? Because we've been talking about influence on Kaladin, influence that Kaladin is taking, but there's also like that exuding influence on the own life, on your own life trajectory from who you are, and like taking that time to think. Because I think specifically about a lot of people in PhD programs who go very quickly into them, and then they get like very burned out, or they get overwhelmed, or they don't have a certain direction, and so they kind of flounder for a while. And like taking that time, whatever your path is, right, to think of how you can influence it itself, I think is really important. Okay, so moving on to our final segment, Wisdom of the Herald moment, which I think the number one wisdom we can take is let's not murder people in our lives. I think that's been a theme, and I think maybe we'll get on the algorithms of the murder podcast that way, but I'm going to take that as my wisdom of the Herald is don't murder people for your own plot. Do that in books, but not in real life. Don't take people out of your life to influence your direction and build them into ideal versions of them so that you can become herald in the new dawning of a new age of religion and universal shattering moments. Thanks, Kaladin. Spoilers for Wind and Truth. Cough, cough. Y'all decided to make a podcast with me, and this is who I am. Granted, we made that decision after all knowing each other for just a few minutes.
It's all good.
And we love you for it.
We do.
So that's my wisdom, is don't murder people for plot in your life. Murder them for other reasons. Liz and Elle, what's your wisdom?
I think my wisdom of the heralds here is to think about the influence that I have on other people and not push them to be what I want them to be too much, but to find out what drives them. Especially with my oldest kids are starting to get to that age where they stop being kids and you have to transition from trying to carefully manage their life to letting them manage their life and being more of an advisor, which is a weird transition, so weird. And finding a balance between like, here are some good ideas I have, but like you get to make the decisions now and have the influence over your own life and being able to let that go. So practicing that, maybe some negative examples from Lirin here. But thinking about the influence that I have over others and wielding it responsibly.
I want to take the idea of leaving people rocks, like Adam was talking about. I think that would be a good thing for me to try to do. I'm very much a words of affirmation, but only if people write them down kind of person. Because I will not remember them. And so I think being just sending a text, or it doesn't have to be a big thing, but doing something little to keep myself in people's minds and to let them know that they're still in mine would be really beneficial. As a fun note, the weirdest anonymous note I've ever gotten, this is not, by the way, a challenge for our listeners, but the weirdest anonymous note I've ever gotten was, "You look like you give good hugs." So, yep.
I think the way our listeners can leave us on notes is by reviewing us and leaving us 5 stars on podcast apps or joining the Patreon. Because then we can influence them by giving them notes through our Discord, right? And that's how we can leave notes for each other. Discord as the new rock laying place. I think if Kaladin had Discord, that's what Tian would have done. I think that sounds very Tian coded.
He just would have put rock emojis on every one of Kaladin's comments.
I like that. The rock emoji as the new, like, I care about you emoji.
It's no longer a heart. It's always a rock. Speaking of rock, ...
Yes, we'll get there soon. Thank you for joining us today on The Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination.
Okay, so moving on to our final segment. You're gonna have to remind me of the name because it's leaving me at 10 o'clock at night.
The wisdom of the heralds.
Wisdom of the heralds. I'm like, storms of the heralds. That is not working in my brain. Heralds of the storms.